Stone Giant. This is a story about Michelangelo's David and how he came to be. There was a giant in the city of Florence. It had been there for nearly 40 years, and no one knew what to do about it. The giant was an enormous block of stone, marble to be exact. It stood 3 times as tall as any man in the city. It was the color of cream, and it was a troublemaker. It hadn't started out that way. In the beginning, the giant, as everyone called it, had been part of a glorious plan for that city. City fathers had hoped to have the stone made into a statue. It was to be a statue of David, the shepherd boy from the Bible who killed the giant warrior, Goliath. David and Florence were a lot alike. At the time, the city was part of a small, proud republic. It often had to fight against bigger, more powerful kingdoms. The statue would remind people that God would protect them, just as he had protected young David. That was the idea anyway, but things didn't turn out as planned. First, one artist, then another, started cutting into the giant. One chopped out a space between David's legs. Another, or maybe the same one, left a bump of stone that looked like a knot for a cloak. But they didn't get very far before they quit or died. So for years, the giant lay in the workyard of the city's cathedral, discarded, with a hole in it, getting rained on. City officials refused to give up on their idea. They offered the giant to other artists. But even the great Leonardo da Vinci took a look at what was left and said, "No, grazie. No, thank you." One artist already knew about the giant. 26-year-old Michelangelo Buonarroti had grown up in Florence. The giant had been around since before he was born. But for some years, the artist had been busy working in Rome. And such work! The sculptures he had created there had stunned people with their detail and beauty. Friends from Florence wrote to Michelangelo. They urged him to come back to Florence. Surely he would be able to do something with the giant, they wrote. So Michelangelo came. What must the artist have thought when he saw the poor, ruined giant? He took a few measurements. He saw that the stone was badly roughed out and weather-worn. But he saw something else too. There in the stone, he saw David, his David. It was as plain as if the shepherd boy were right there before him. David had been there all along, waiting. Michelangelo went to the city fathers and asked to work on the giant. They gave him the job. Maybe they had real hope that he could create something beautiful. Maybe they just wanted to be rid of the big headache. Michelangelo wasn't about to have people gawking at him as he worked. He built a wooden shed around the giant. Then he set out his tools, hammers, chisels, and a special drill called a bow. He must have thought it was funny that he was getting ready to conquer a giant, just as David had. He made up a little poem about it. David with a sling, and I with a bow, Michelangelo. On the front of the stone, he drew the outline of his David. Then all that was needed was to carve away what was not David. Michelangelo was young and strong. Chips of marble flew through the air. Some were tiny, others as thick as his fist. If he chipped off even a bit too much, the statue would be ruined. Throughout Florence, rumors flew as fast as the stone chips. The statue would be a triumph, some said. No, said others, the stone was too damaged. It would be a disaster. The people could only listen to the sounds coming from the shed and wonder and wait. Day after day, Michelangelo worked furiously. Every night he went home flowered with the dust of not David. He combed bits of not David from his beard. In summer, the stone dust mingled with the sweat on his skin and made a kind of mud. In winter, his breath hung in the air. He stopped only when he had to eat or to sleep. Some nights he was too tired to undress and slept in his clothes. In the morning he began again. He worked from the front of the stone inward. Slowly, David began to emerge. Here was a hand. There was a knee. It was as if the artist were pulling David out of the stone where he had been hiding. Then one day, after nearly 3 years, Michelangelo put down his tools. He stepped back and looked at what he had created. Where once an unwanted giant had been, now David stood. The statue was nearly 18 feet tall, so it was still a giant after all. And giant statues are not exactly easy to move. The wall of the work yard had to be knocked down so the statue could be hauled out. It was put in a special frame to keep it safe. Then the frame was rolled along on logs. 40 men sweated for 4 days to move the giant through the streets of Florence and place it on a pedestal in the city square. Then, at long last, the people of Florence got their first look at their David. They had been waiting for 40 years. What a shiver of excitement must have passed through the crowd when the statue was unveiled. The people of Florence had seen David statues before, but they had never seen anything like this. All those other artists had shown David after the story was already over. Still and calm, standing over the dead Goliath. But Michelangelo showed David in the middle of the story, the exciting part, just as David faced the giant. David was without armor, naked, his right hand curled around an unseen rock. The other hand reached for the slingshot at his shoulder. His eyes were focused on the approaching enemy, as if judging the distance between them. The muscles and veins that Michelangelo had carved from cold marble appeared to pulse with life. The whole body seemed about to spring into action, about to hold the stone at Goliath's head and kill him. All those other Davids had been skinny little boys. This David was all grown up. He was beautiful, strong and powerful. His face shone with defiance. This David seemed perfectly capable of taking on any enemy, no matter how big. And that was exactly how the people of Florence wanted to see themselves. Michelangelo was a genius, they declared, and David was a masterpiece. The citizens of Florence embraced the statue as the perfect symbol of the Republic. And Michelangelo? He saw his David. He was just as the artist had seen him when he first looked at the enormous stone. There was a giant in the city of Florence. Stone Giant, written by Jane Sutcliffe and illustrated by John Shelley. This is a story about Michelangelo's David and how he came to be.